Absolutely. And when you mention core values, there's value for each type to the team. There is value that each type brings to the table. But the other piece to remember before I dive into the core values piece is that DISC is a XY axis graph, right? We are not one or the other. It's not black and white. We are a mixture and a combination of all of them. For instance, I am an ICD.
And welcome back to the Money, the Mindset, and the Mentoring podcast. Today we have Andrea Johnson. She is the host of the Stand Tall and Own It podcast and the owner of The Intentional Optimist. She's a coach. She's a DISC, one of my favorite words, expert. And we're here to talk today about core values, about DISC, about everything that we can do to help understand ourselves better. So thank you very much for joining the show.
Oh, I'm always happy to be here. And if this conversation ends up being anywhere as fun as the pre-recorded conversation, it's going to be great.
Well, I think that is definitely going to be the case. So let's hit DISC, because I've been doing DISC since, I think it was like, we're going to say 2014. And my understanding of DISC is it's a really good index tool to help people really use it as a starting point to kind of figure out, number one, how to understand themselves, where they're going to, generally like, oh, that's right, that's why I'm so good at this, or that's right, I'm not very good at this. But then also have that interplay relationship with other people, because they can understand, well, because I'm this way, I'm going to do really well with interfacing with this type of person. And here's where I'm also going to have some challenges. And
Absolutely.
So using that as a fundamental building block, I want to kind of delve into DISC a little bit further into the next levels, because there's so many different levels of how DISC can play out. And I want to get your insights into the next levels.
Sure. Well, just as a reminder for your audience, if they don't know, DISC and C stands for either dominant or driver, which is about 3% of the population. These are your bottom line people. I are your influencers, or your, there's another one I was using. All of a sudden it just
Those who are of a gregarious nature.
Well, yes, we wear yellow. We smile, and like I did a thing this last week. I wore bright orange pants. So it's like, these are the ones
bright orange pants. We're like kin.
Yeah, well, you're a DI, right? So,
there you go.
We're the ones that don't mind being noticed. I don't mind. You can throw me up on stage, ask me to talk, and just tell me what you want me to talk about. So about 11% of the population. The S stands for steady, steady. I just keep saying but these are about 69% of the population. These are the backbone of your team. These are in the boat, they're going to be the ones pulling the oars. They're the ones making sure the trains run on time. These are the people, when you worked in change management, Steve, that did not want to change, right? That's why we have to have change managers, because 69% of the people want to keep the status quo. That's not bad. That's really good, right? This is why your teams move forward. And then the C in DISC stands for compliant or creative, depending on what you look at in that. And these are your detail people. These are your accountants. These are your musicians. These are the ones who want to make sure they get it right. So they're going to ask you 10,000 questions, and it's going to drive you as a D nuts. And then they're going to have what they need, and they're going to move on. So that's DISC in a nutshell. But one of the things that I love to highlight with DISC is I grew up in Korea. I grew up in Seoul, Korea. My parents were missionaries, and I went to school with kids from about 65 different countries.
Wow.
So, yeah. So number one, I had a Korean woman who worked in my home. My parents took Korean language school, and it is the second hardest language for English speaking people to learn how to speak. Now, I just at lunch was watching a K-drama, and I still for sure read all of the English subtitles, because it really is that hard, even though I grew up there. But when I watch a K-drama, I have to read the subtitles. When I walk into a room, if it's a room where people don't have English as their first language, I either need to speak their language, or I need to make sure that there's someone there who can interpret for me. It's in the patterns that we have in our communication style. So if I walked into a Korean post office and just said, hey, I need to buy a stamp, they might look at me and say, But if I walk in and I ask them in Korean, or if I need to go to the restroom and say, 화장실 어디 있습니까? Then they would actually be able to tell me what I need to know. So DISC is a way of helping people communicate in a language that their hearers understand. Does that help?
That makes so much sense. And it'll be interesting because our transcripting gets done by a AI tool that is in the language of English. And so when it translates what you said in Korean, it'll be really fun to see that come out.
Yeah, we'll say it really slow. 화장실, which is bathroom. 화장실. It'd be really interesting to see if it puts it in the actual Hangul.
That'd be amazing. It's designed for English language. We actually have it designed for every language, but you have to put
Right.
the input language in.
Yeah.
Eventually, we'll be able to do the conversions, but that's not yet.
It would be nice if we could do that in our teams, though, wouldn't it? I mean, I'm talking to podcasters on how to use DISC in podcasting, and you have to remember who your audience is. It's our responsibility as the speaker to make sure that the listener gets our message. And so
I love that idea of ownership, right?
Yeah.
You own the fact that your listeners are either going to engage or they're not going to. And as a speaker, you need that.
If they don't, whose fault is it?
That's right.
It's mine, right?
That's right.
So if I started saying these things and your eyes just kind of glazed over, I would need to change my tactics real fast.
That's right.
You know, start doing jumping jacks in the background or something.
Well, so when we look at DISC, and I've heard it said from many things about the index and stuff, but it's interesting to think of it as a language of communication, is that it's sort of how we communicate with our tasks, or we communicate with people.
Yes.
And you know, my D is like Russian, and somebody's I is like Spanish, and each of them have different language, and we convert those. And sometimes in the conversion is where we get things kerfuddled.
Absolutely.
Is that, you know, you're gonna say it, I'm gonna kind of, well, I think I know what that means, and so I'm gonna respond with my language in my head. Like, you know, I was actually just talking with a guy, we were talking about that, who spoke Russian, and I'm like, when you sleep and you think in Russian, and now you speak in English, when you dream in Russian. And so the idea is with the DISC is everything's processing in that mode. And when you're trying to convert it, you have to be very sensitive to how to do those conversions.
You have to be very intentional. Right? You have to be very intentional. And growing up, I said in Korea, Korean is like my second language. But I took Spanish in high school because for some reason at the time, I didn't think Korean could be used anywhere else in the world. And I had no foresight whatsoever.
That every great sushi restaurant is run by Koreans?
That's odd itself, you know, but I mean, I'm in Little Charlottesville, Virginia, and I can't tell you how many Korean restaurants are right down the street. But even in the career that I had of 25 years in higher education schools of medicine, so many Koreans study medicine and come over to do research, and then they go home, but they're the ones who take English as a language. We don't take Korean. But what happens for me in that way you think is, first I think in English, but if I'm going to think in another language, even though I know I'm speaking Spanish to somebody, it goes through Korean and then Spanish. Because that's just the way our brain works, right? So when we understand the patterns that our brain has like developed and works in, then we can start seeing the patterns that other people's brains work in. Not because we can see inside their brains, but because DISC is essentially a behavioral analysis tool. It shows us how people behave. One of the funnest ones I love is giving people the assessment and letting them come back to me and looking at the shock on their face when they find out they're an S. And I say, why is that so surprising? You know, I mean, S's are 69% of the population. And I had one girl say, both me and my fiance were stunned. And I said, why? I said, because I'm so bossy. I thought I would be a D. And I think it's just really interesting to see how we have perceptions of different types and different ways of communicating, that D's, who are pretty much bottom line people, they're results oriented. It's like, it's the too long didn't read people, you know, but they're also the ones who make things happen. So you're not going to boss somebody around. You're more likely to just go do it yourself.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
S's are the ones who are all about making everybody feel included, all about team cohesion. Everybody gets on the boat. Everybody pulls the oars at the same time. Those are your S's. And those actually tend to be the ones who are more bossy, but they're also the ones who can make things happen that the D's can tell them about, right? So it's interesting to me to see people's perceptions of the way we communicate and kind of take those and shatter them for a little while and then let them rebuild into a way that's really productive to help them with team cohesion.
Well, and the thing is, I think a lot of people look at DISC and they have a perception. And I think you're right. Where that one lady said, I'm bossy, so I should be a D. She perceives herself that there's a higher value in being a D than being an S, rather than understanding the principal value that she has as her core value of who she is.
Sure. Rather
than the idea of saying I should be something that I'm not.
Yeah. Absolutely. And when you mention core values, there's value for each type to the team. There is value that each type brings to the table. But the other piece to remember before I dive into the core values piece is that DISC is a XY axis graph, right? We are not one or the other. It's not black and white. We are a mixture and a combination of all of them. For instance, I am an ICD. I have all of them but S. I am the definition of a non-team player. But when you look at it on that you mentioned whether or not you're task or people oriented, that's the x-axis, but the y-axis is outgoing and reserved. So you could have somebody who's really reserved, but still pretty bossy because they want to take care of people. And I think that we've given bossiness this negative connotation when in reality it's a leadership trait. And we need to be able to refilter that for them and help them see it differently. But core values pops up because not only do we understand the language that we speak, but with DISC, but what we have is the way that we're internally wired. And if someone is internally wired to have respect be the most important thing that's their one non-negotiable and you can't mess with that, it doesn't matter who you are or how you communicate. If you disrespect, you're done. It doesn't
So
matter.
how does the DISC tie in? Because I've looked at the DISC where DISC does the level where it says, okay, this is who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've seen it where it says, this is how others perceive you DISC.
Okay.
And then there's this, how you perceive others perceiving you DISC.
Yes.
And then there's the way that you act, when you're isolated, like in your own head, and then how you're acting in the space. And I've seen the one where you're like, I think it's got 12 different breakdowns of like, are you altruistic? Are you this and all those things? But I haven't seen the breakdown where it goes into core values. So that's the one that I'm very interested in learning a little bit about.
So I'm a Maxwell team certified DISC consultant. The Maxwell communication report for adults is 30 pages. It does not go into core values, but it does go into a lot of do's and don'ts and what your motivations are. So it's really important to know who's motivated by what, right? If you've got a team member that's motivated by money, don't give them praise and balloons. They need the money. If they're motivated by praise and balloons, then money doesn't matter, right? So that's where core values begin to show up in the adult assessment. But as I shared with you before we started recording, my son is 15 and just took the college and career one. And it actually has a breakdown of an idea based on where he tested out of what his core values might be. I even had one person ask me in a leadership training seminar, are there like specific core values that go with specific DISC types? Well, no, but we're going to lean more toward them. If you're more on the people side of things, the S and the I, you're probably going to have core values that are more relational. You know what I'm saying? And if you are more on the task side, you may have core values that are a little more results or task or authenticity related, or like don't challenge me or don't question my ability or my honesty. That's where those kinds of things come up. But what I do with my clients is first I give them the DISC because it's doesn't take long to take. It's anywhere from 10 to, my son took 30 minutes and he was upset with me, but he came out as a high C. So now I see why it took 30 minutes. But because I kept asking him, are you okay? Was it taking too long?
Yeah.
So it takes anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes. I've had a lot of clients say, I finished it, but I thought I was taking the practice test. This was so fast, but it's so accurate. I'm stunned. So it's 10 to 20 minutes. And then we start walking through it. And in that report gives them an understanding of kind of maybe where they are landing in certain areas. Once we start getting into how things play out for them, then we start looking at their core values, helping them uncover the things that are their non-negotiables, those things that are their compass, their North Star. Some people are like, I don't talk about all that touchy-feely inside stuff. Well, for me, it's not even really touchy-feely. For me, it's the things that are in here that make me who I am. That's what I want to communicate well. That's what I want. I want my husband to understand that my top core value is what I would call freedom of thought or autonomy of thought. And for him to be an SC or a CS and be able to, look at me and say, wouldn't you agree that, I don't like, can we start over? Because I mean, you got it, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me to be able to finally articulate, because I understood that my core value is not freedom. My core value is freedom of thought. It's autonomy of thought. I'm a critical thinker. I'm a natural deconstructionist. So when I say to him, can we restructure that? How are you going to say that? And so then he thought about it. And now we've come up with, what do you think about this topic? And because one of the things he married me for was my ability to have a really good conversation with him. And a great Saturday morning is when he and I sit across from each other in the living room and have a thorny theological conversation, right?
Nice.
Which does not sound relaxing to a lot of people, but we appreciate each other for who we are, and being able to articulate my core values in a way that he, like as an I to a C, so that he would understand, meant that now we have way better communication and understanding of each other in our relationship.
It makes so much sense, I think, for any couple who's together to get a disc done, both of you, because then you can communicate in the way that that person, that you're going to where they are, not trying to take them where you are.
Right.
And, you know, I think of like 95D, 95I. My S and C is a sliver. And my wife is 95S, 95C, and the other two are slivers.
Perfect.
And so it's perfect when you know how to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so perfect when you're, why is she just not making a decision? Like, let's just go. Why is he moving so fast? Like, why can't he just slow down and just like smell the roses a little bit? Like, you know, the idea of not understanding. And it was only until we did the disc profile that we went, okay, now we know how to communicate with each other. And we go to where that person is. If we're trying to move an agenda, we go to where they are. We don't try to bring them to where we are.
Right.
And it promotes a better communication strategy.
Absolutely. I had a client for about a year and a half that was a veterinary hospital. And one particular physician was the one that kept coming up. I can't communicate with this person. This is too hard. Even the owners, like, I don't get this. And so the manager that I was working with and was my executive coaching client, she was like a mid-level manager, talked to this doctor about it and said, could we do a disc? Because we'd done it on the people that I was coaching, but we hadn't done it on this doctor. And she said, sure, I would love to be understood, right? That was what she said. Turns out she's a pure C. Not many adults come out as one letter, but she came out so high in the C that as soon as they started having conversations, my client looked at me and said, this is a godsend. I cannot believe how much better, because this person was an oncologist, right? So they wanted everything to be done precisely well. Well, I lost my mother to cancer, so I understand. And I worked in the oncology center at Hopkins for almost 12 years. So I understand the desire of someone like that to make sure that everything is done precisely. And as soon as the people around her started understanding that that's where her questions were coming from, that's where her attention to detail was coming from, it cleared. I mean, of course, they're still going to have like some conflicts, but all of a sudden, people understood what they were looking at. And then the same manager, her top core value is reliability. And core values are by definition reciprocal. I'm going to be reliable and I want you to be reliable. And so she was able to take that in as well and say, here's my core value. I know that you need all this information. You need it done well and you need everything precise. I want you to know you can count on me and I'm going to count on you. And those things layered together really brought so much harmony to that team.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
It's so good. I don't think I've ever seen 100% C or like dominant C to that level. I've seen one where it was, I would say there were about 85 C, and then the other balance was in the D column. And that one is a very strong personality. And knowing how to work with that personality, you can get some great results with that type of personality.
Pure task.
Pure task. And as long as they understand that that's how to interface with the I's and the S's, because they can sometimes make collaboration a little bit difficult.
You know what we do with really strong D's and C's is we actually turn their communication with the I's and the S's into their task result that they're looking for. So it becomes we gamify it for them. I can't tell you how many D's have benefited from the gamifying of making sure that their communication happens appropriately. And all the rest of us are like, oh, thank you. So that's another option for those D's and C's.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you also have your podcast, and your podcast, Stand Tall and Own It. Talk to me a little bit about what that's all about.
Well, my business name is The Intentional Optimist, and that started all because of my losing my mother to cancer. I was 50, and she died well. I turned 50 in August of 2016, and she died in 2017. And she went in hospice in September. And up until the last minute, she was consistently saying, what have I not told you? What can I tell you better? And she was on the floor playing with my 8-year-old adopted son and making sure that she did everything she possibly could. Now, do I think my mother lived a life all the way up until that point that tried to celebrate each day? Sure, I do. And I can see that in her life, and I can see how she grew and the things that she did. But watching that process, some people say 50 is not young to lose a parent, because I have friends who have lost parents much younger. But I was young enough and I had a young son. I said, you know what? I don't want to do that. So that's where intentional optimism came from. And I was not quite sure how to share my message. And I listened to a speaking coach, and during the pandemic, I was outside pulling weeds out of my garden. And one of the things she talked about on her podcast was, is podcasting your next stage? And I stood up, looked around to nobody, right? Nobody was there, and said, yes, it is. And I realized, and that's why I do these interviews as well, because the best way for me to communicate is through my actual speaking and talking and seeing your face and the reactions and the conversation back and forth. So it started off as the Intentional Optimist Unconventional Leaders, where I interviewed, I think it was 75 different women for leadership that they didn't recognize, because I want women to see that they are leaders no matter what. And I said, you can lead at any stage in any area. The first person you lead, as Maxwell always says, is yourself. And then you lead your family, and then you lead outside of that. And I wanted women to see these unconventional leaders. But I hit a point where I realized I have to start embodying all this. I'm only 5'1.5" on a really good day. And even though I have a big personality, and I felt like it was time for a rebrand. So I rebranded to Stand Tall and Own It. And the purpose of this is to help get my passion across for helping female leaders lead with passion and authenticity, knowing that they can change the culture, any culture, by using their own critical thinking to create imaginatively and lead effectively. And I do all of that through my coaching and my podcasting. So you're going to get a lot of that stuff. I actually just did a series on the 5 different tools that I use. So you can check that out to see what those 5 tools are. The next one's coming out next week, the second week of April.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I love Stand Tall and Own It. And I would never have guessed by our conversation. I would have thought you were like 5'10". So 5'1". There we go. We got some amplified height there. But you also have comfort when you sit in the seats on the airplane. So
I do.
You get both. Yeah.
It doesn't matter. I'll take the window seat.
That's right. Well, I've definitely enjoyed our conversation today, and DISC really resonates with me. I think John Maxwell is a modern day thought leader, and I think having that ability to connect with his work and everything that he's doing, I think is fantastic, and being able to bring that forward, through people like yourself who are bringing the message out, I think is absolutely wonderful. So thank you so much for joining with us today. And obviously for anybody who wants to get a hold of you, check out the podcast, Stand Tall and Own It, as a podcast with Andrea Johnson, or go to theintentionaloptimist.com to check her out and get to know yourself a little bit better.
Yeah, thank you. This was a blast. I enjoyed this very much. And I look forward to hearing from somebody who might have a question after this conversation.
That sounds amazing. Awesome. And this is the Money, the Mindset, and the Mentoring podcast. We will see you on the next one.